Hey guys, it's Bella, and this is the sort of last week of the paleography guides videos that I'm putting up on this channel. It's not really about any individual Latin script directly, it's more about some considerations for how you can use the study of codicology to help you in sort of high fantasy world building and conlangery and all the rest of it, because that's a big reason why I find paleography so engaging myself. So it's worth talking a little bit about what reading actually meant in the medieval world. And a fun fact that most people don't really know about the medieval time was that all reading in the medieval world was oral, so they didn't really seem to read in their head and only keep it in their mind. So even if they were reading privately, people would mutter the words loud. And Hugo St. Victor describes a threefold process of learning in his big treatise on how to read sacred texts called the Didascalion. And this, for the first stage, is lectio, which is literally the process of reading the words aloud, the way the information sort of first enters one's mind. Then you have the digestio, which is sort of contemplating the meaning of the words obtained through the process of lectio. And then ruminatio, which you might be able to tell is related to our word ruminate, is about meditating deeper upon the implications of those words and how they can apply to other situations, etc. So, as evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum would suggest, a lot of literature in ancient Greece and Rome was preserved in papyrus scrolls, and scrolls would be stored in these weird little shells which had these crisscrossing lines of wood, and they would store the scrolls in the sort of V section. And sometimes scrolls would actually be stored in baskets when they're in public, such as this example of a statue showing a orator's scrolls all bundled together into a basket. And you can also see in this stone carving on the left, we can see a little boy in a school, and he's got a little cupboard with books and a lectern that's open. And actually, in the Middle Ages, art scrolls were quite commonly used as a form of speech bubble. It's like a very primitive form of speech bubble. They would wrap around the individual, and the text of what they were saying would be written on the scroll itself, and this was a way of communicating speech at the time. So the codex, which we can see, well, we can't see it represented directly here actually, it became popular in the 3rd and 4th centuries Common Era, but scrolls, like we can see in the bottom right hand corner here, remained in use right into the medieval period, but they were more commonly used for certain kinds of documents such as legal records. And then wax tablets, like the kind we have in the left of this image, were used as the main medium for writing little tidbits which could be erased when one no longer needed them. They were like a personal notebook of the time. And sometimes you would also get these little throwaway bits of information written on what are called ostraca, or sort of these are bits of pottery with a large, relatively flat surface, so people would write on them when the pot had broken, and then once, of course, the bit of writing was no longer relevant, they would just throw the ostracon away. So let's talk a bit about monastic libraries of the early Middle Ages, because they're very exciting. And here for your viewing is a image from the Codex Amiatinus, the earliest complete Latin Bible, showing the prophet Ezra, and it shows a sort of rather pretty bookshelf behind him. Because following the fall of Rome, monasteries were the only institutions which had the stability, resources, and the time to keep copying manuscripts. So the texts which survived from the classical period were the ones which monks valued. And most monastic rules, such as the rule of Saint Benedict, whence this image is taken, emphasized reading as part of the daily routine for monastic adherents, and some, such as the rule of Chrodogang, mandated that monks and mass priests had to own certain books among their personal possessions. The Gospels and the Psalter were actually especially popular, and the Psalter was the main text which young boys would use, especially in the continent, to learn their Latin before in Anglo-Saxon England and other places colloquies became a more common pedagogical tool. And we can often identify personal libraries from lists of books in wills and in charters because these will give the books owned in a given place or by a given person, and it can give us a sense, in addition to identifying references made to other texts in their personal writings, what kind of reading material the person had available to them. And there's been a lot of work done, for instance, in reconstructing the library that the Venerable Bede had available to him at Monk Weymouth Jarrow by studying the classical references he cites in his text Historia Ecclesiastica. So when you had the rise of secular universities as a contrast in the 13th, 14th centuries, not taking over, but developing as an alternative to monastic sources, alternative places of learning. These were, in England, the first ones were Oxford and Cambridge. These were the first secular libraries of Western Europe, although the first ones would have been in the continent as well. And these initial secular libraries assembled various codices on law, natural science, and theology. And in these libraries, the books were normally chained to the desks, and you can see actually on the screen a surviving medieval library in Merton College, Oxford, where the books are actually chained to the shelves. And this is to prevent theft, because the books are extremely valuable. They're sort of the price of almost like a car today, really expensive. Now granted, the cost of books did diminish as you go from the early Middle Ages to the later Middle Ages, partly because you had more books that were produced and being used from earlier centuries, so there were more books in circulation, partly because the number of scriptoria grew, and so there were more monks available to copy. And then when you get to the later Middle Ages, you have things like, well, the printing press is the biggest cost reducing factor, but you also have secular scriptoria, like those producing books for these secular universities, which were producing books for market rates and therefore in quite high volumes. And medieval librarians, such as those working in this library with all the books chained to the walls, they developed what's called a second folio reference to help prevent theft. And it's quite a clever system. So basically what they would do is the librarian would own a list of all of the books in the library, and each book would have a 3 words, and these are what we now understand as the second folio reference. And these are the words that you find when you open up the second page of the manuscript. The reason being that the first page may be damaged, the text might be worn away, so it could be easily erased. The second page is less likely to be erased in such a fashion, and this was partly done in order to identify that it was in fact the same book being returned for those medieval libraries that allowed books to be borrowed. And so if it came back and someone was giving you this book but it had a different second folio reference, it would be an indication that they had maybe swapped the book for a cheaper version or something to this effect. And the reason this works so well is because you have it's hand production, so each scribe is writing maybe a slightly different size, different amounts of spacing between the words, even if you have exactly the same text starting each manuscript, the first 3 words on the second folio are probably going to be different each time, and therefore it's quite an effective sort of cataloguing system for the books in your possession. But if that didn't work and people did still steal books, medieval librarians would sometimes write curses or anathema in their books against would-be thieves. Now this one on the screen is not actually a curse or anathema against book theft, but it's actually just a really charming scene from ordinary medieval life where somebody left a book open during the night and a cat walked over the book and urinated on it, and the owner was very angry and he wrote F this cat, and he wrote this little rant about how terrible this cat is. Cursed be this terrible cat who pissed on this book during the night in Daventry. And it suggested to everyone that they not leave books open through the night where cats may wander. So, stuff like this was believed to be caused by this sort of demon of scribes called Titivillus, who was a he would torment scribes by knocking over their inkwells, by making animals do weird things, by making them forgetful, making them miss lines, all sorts of really interesting things. And this is a fresco from a church showing Tityrillus in the flesh, and he's holding a scroll with words all jumbled out of order to demonstrate how he throws everything into confusion. So now that we've gone from the Middle Ages, I want to talk a little bit about a medieval scholar who was quite influential, and this is J.R.R. Tolkien, because Tolkien, like any practicing medievalist in his day, was a skilled palaeographer. As an example of a manuscript we know that he read, he produced an edition of the Old English heroic poem Exodus, which is found in Oxford Bodleian Library, MS Junius 11, and it's a curious little thing. It was published posthumously by a student of his, and it made 3,000 copies, and to this day they are the very worst selling J.R.R. Tolkien book, because not many people are interested, and his interpretation of Exodus and even his approach to editing the text is by now long since outdated, because Tolkien's academic approach was quite reliant on the old philological method, which by the time of his death and retirement was no longer in the academic vogue. However, in producing content for Middle-earth, Tolkien drew massively from particularly early medieval English sources. The term Middle-earth itself is a borrowing of the Old English word Midden-Jæren, which is sort of, Middle Earth. And Tolkien was quite a prolific conlanger. He created languages for his fantasy world and then built a world. Well, he didn't create languages for the world, he created the languages, and he created a world for the languages to inhabit. And he made a Tengwar script, which would be used in the writing of his elven languages, Quenya and Sindarin. But he would also make these runic alphabets for the dwarves, which are based on the Old English Germanic runes. And it's worth noting, those of you who have been observant this whole series might have already picked up on this, that in Tolkien's own sort of calligraphic handwriting, we can see on this map, the sort of the lowercase letters that he writes are basically humanist minuscule, and the capitals are these sort of insular half unsealed capitals, which he would have seen over and over again in the English manuscripts that he studied for his academic work. So we can see how Tolkien is drawing from medieval sources and bringing them directly into the creation of Middle-earth. And here is some Quenya script drawn by Tolkien himself in one of his manuscripts, the Bodleian Library MS Tolkien Drawings 90 folio 30R. I partly bring this up to show you that I just find it really cool that Tolkien's own handwritten documents are classified in the same way as medieval manuscripts are. It feels almost appropriate that somebody who made such a sort of medieval high fantasy aesthetic and made that standard in a genre should be remembered in this way. This is a facsimile that Tolkien produced of the last page of the Book of Mazarbul, and it's quite famous because in the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson, Gandalf reads this in the Mines of Moria, and there's that deadly last line, "They are coming," and Tolkien brings out a lot of sort of understanding of how texts work to put a lot of information onto the page. So first of all, the use of sort of poor quality vellum sort of indicates that the scribes had quite little choice. So the imagery that you get from the story of the text itself is that the dwarves are sort of holed up in a hall and orcs are trying to get in and they've barricaded the doors, but they can't hold the orcs out for too long. And these are diary entries almost written in the last few days while they try and hold a barricade against the orcs, who are like this horde that has swept over Moria. So in such a context, they couldn't have exactly gone outside to make new parchment for a better quality parchment, so they would have had to use this very frayed parchment that they had, and it would have been frayed further by being left unattended for so long enough for the bodies to decay into skeletons. Similarly, the faded ink on the page suggests that it's been read quite often, and or that it's just sort of decayed in the meantime. In fact, the blue would imply that there's been some kind of metal overlying that section, maybe a blade that's stuck into the book. And lastly, more interestingly, the script sort of becomes more cursive and less well executed as, the dwarves are almost not so much hasty, because obviously they're sort of, well, maybe they are being hasty, and when the care is no longer being given as they're getting more and more desperate and afraid. You can see this in the last few lines. The runes become more cursive and less well executed, and all of this comes together in amazing fashion to give this sense of the terror involved in the fall of Moria. And it's no longer on show, but I got to see this in person when I went to the Tolkien exhibit in the Bodleian Library a few years ago. It was a wonderful exhibit. And moving on from Tolkien, I want to talk about paleography and codicology in one of my my favourite computer game of all time, that is Arx Fatalis. So this is a sort of screenshot from the opening cinematic. So Arx Fatalis is set in a high fantasy medieval setting, and based on this level of sort of technological development and social organisation, it seems to like the creators have modelled it roughly on like late Middle Ages Europe, so 1300s, 1400s kind of thing. Books aren't actually very rare in the human kingdom, but they're not very common either. And most of the citizens seem to be literate. And there's writing in the church and the crypt all around, and sometimes citizens send letters to each other. The common language in this world, I think, is actually Latin, for a few reasons. One of which is that in all this like iconography, the names of royal figures, both in sort of the art and in the game itself, they seem like they're Latinate, like Poxelis, Alia, etc., Orbi Planax, whereas commoners have Spanish names such as Miguel and Carlo, and this suggests to me that maybe there's a sort of, a Latin and a classical Latin and a vulgar Latin diglossia happening in the world of Arx Fatalis. And of course all the writing on the walls is also written in Latin, which is further evidence that I think that they are meant to be speaking Latin in the game, even though obviously the game interfaces in English. And there are many other races in the world of Arx Fatalis. Basically what happens is there's like goblins and dwarves and rat men and trolls, and in their world the sun has actually faded, and so they've all sort of gone to live underground in these caves that keep in the heat. And there are these like travelers guilds who are the only people who are able to make journeys between these mines that have now become cities and communicate information and trade. It's quite astounding. And there's a cult in the world that's sacrificing blood to this demon, which promises that it can bring back the sun so people can go back outside. It's a really interesting game, lots of great psychology. The world building in Arx Fatalis is just amazing. And I said it was based on late medieval Europe. A lot of the art style, especially of the interiors of the human kingdom, are really well modelled on the sort of miniatures that you see in late medieval illuminated manuscripts. And as an example, here's the Royal Library, and you might recall that the book stands we see here, they mirror that we see in the Codex Amiatinus. They resemble those in Merton College, Oxford, and some of the books actually are fixed to the shelves. You can't take them off. It's very, I think it's very realistically, faithfully done. And there's quite a few books in the world, and one thing I really love is that Arx Fatalis is one of the only fantasy games where the main way that you navigate the world is not by sort of hacking and slashing. You have to actually engage with the world. You have to, like, some of the books are important. You have to read them to understand the plot and to progress in the game. And if you just fight your way through, it's much harder, and you don't enjoy it as much, but also it's really difficult actually to win the game if you just smash your way through. And you have to do things like bake cakes and smith weapons and all sorts of things. You really have to be immersed in the world in order to play the game. Now the font that they use in the books of this world is, it doesn't seem like it's very medieval, if I'm being honest. the closest thing it resembles to me is humanist minuscule script. If you guys have any differing opinions, let me know in the comment section if you think it resembles some kind of medieval script. In undergrad, actually, I took this excerpt and I translated it into quite bad Latin, but I think I could do a much better job now, and I gave a go at writing it in Gothic script because I thought it would look much cooler in Litera Gothica Textura, and I didn't do a great job, but I thought I'd show it. And lastly about Arx Fatalis is that it's got a really unique sort of mechanism for casting spells where you have to draw these magical runes in the air, and each rune is like a syllable, and I think it's implied that these runes are of a sort of secret ancient language in the world. Some of them actually have sort of Norse sounding names like Frigga and this kind of stuff. It's a really unique system, and I'm surprised that I've not seen it replicated in other games. It's a curious one. And now I'd like to talk about actually my own conlanging and conscript. So I have a sort of fancy world, and it developed as a exercise in writing Latin prose. I sort of envisioned this world populated with the beast from medieval literature that I find most intriguing personally, and these are the dogheads, because they sit in this weird sort of intersection between animals and humans in the medieval mind. And so I made a world where they all speak Latin, these dogheads, and I created documents in history of these people in their own dialect of Latin, and so I created these scripts in which they would write. And using my knowledge of how palaeography worked, I sort of evolved the Latin alphabet in my fantasy world over time. So the very earliest version of their alphabet, which I call the runic alphabet, dates from the very beginnings of their sort of civilization. And then in early waiting times, which are sort of later periods, you had an older minuscule, and in this older minuscule you can see the connection still to the runic letters. The general principle is that each of the double lines in the runic ones get inverted and evened out in the minuscule version. So the A, that other line goes up to the top and looks like that. Or it simply gets removed, as in the B. And there's quite a big conservatism in basic radical shapes. So there's only a few actual shapes, like this tick, which gets repeated and flipped around in various permutations to form different letters. And then you had the new minuscule, when they start to write on slightly different materials. Mainly they start to write on papyrus, so they can have a more cursive flowing shape to it, as opposed to carving into wood, which they were using for these and for these. And over the centuries, this developed into a more cursive set minuscule, which I personally quite liked. On the bottom, I developed it to look deliberately very beautiful and calligraphic, and I think it's quite nice. The dog heads actually write in reed pens on papyrus by the end, because they have a taboo against all animals, never using animal products. And I wrote this. This is the first line of what is basically their pater noster, their Our Father, and you can see it written in the 4 different scripts, in the runic, the old minuscule, newer minuscule, and the cursive minuscule. And it's like, all in nobis descendit Deus. A long time ago, God came down with us, or for our sake, and this is part of their origin myth of how God descended to them from the mountains. And I also designed coins and grave markers from their world, with their writing on them. And the left one reads, if I can read this correctly, here lies here lie the bones of here lie the bones of Vivasius, a merchant Here lie the bones of Evasius the merchant. May God lead him into the fields of plenty. In Campus Plenitudinus is a line that's sort of borrowed from medieval Christianity and like modified a bit, but there you go. And there's an abbreviation actually in the very last word. DS is written for Deus, and to the right is what's called a Pertacus coin of King Ratho, and it's they normally just contain the bust of the monarch and a sort of cross circle which represents actually bread, not a Christian cross, and the runic inscription around the edge, which is something that they retain for the use on coins even into later periods of their history. It reads Parat panem prophetis Deus Rex Ratho, and in a religious dialect of Doghead Latin, the nominative comes actually at the end of the sentence, such as Deus, and the verb comes at the beginning, whereas the regular order is VSO in ordinary speech. And even in ordinary speech, it's customary for them to locate the verb Deus at the end if it's about God. But anyway, the legend itself actually reads, God provides bread through the prophets, and the reason for this is that, and then it says King Ratho, which is his name, King Ratho, and the reason for this is that they believe that bread is sort of emblematic of civilization, and it was their God who sort of raised them from the status of beasts, and therefore God provides for his people food through the prophets, and through and these prophets are the ancestors of their present day kings. And one last thing to note is that I actually chose to use percola et comata to write this out, except that I sort of separated each individual word just for the sake of ease, although probably I'd stick to more typical percola et comata if I were trying to reproduce a manuscript of Gothic. Sorry, I'm not of Gothic, of Doghead or Sidron script, as I call it. So thank you for putting up with listening to my ramblings about my own fantasy world, and if you are a conlanger or a palaeographer, I just wanted to give you some considerations that you can take away from the study of palaeography to help you make literacy in your fantasy world function more realistically to how it would in a medieval European setting. And this is something that bugs me, because a lot of computer games don't put much effort into how text looks in their games or where you can read them. They normally just put it in a type font, and I think this is really dull, because one of the reasons I love palaeography is that the way a script looks is this beautiful medieval aesthetic so much of the time, and it gets lost if you just have Times New Roman or whatever. So with that being said, if you're making a fantasy world which includes reading and writing, please bear the following in mind. So there's never just one kind of script that's used in the world. So even in the Carolingian era, where all kinds of books being written in Carolingian minuscule, they would use uncials for punctuation, they would use rustic capitals for chapter headings. They had all different kinds of scripts that they knew how to write, and they probably had a kind of minuscule for personal writings as well. Think about what different kinds of scripts exist in your fantasy language, and what do they get used for. How have scripts changed across time in your fantasy world? Older scripts tend to be more prestigious, which is why in coins in my fantasy world I use the older runic script. But scripts are never static, they never sort of stay solid for a very long period of time. Consider also how information gets laid out on the page, like whether it's in 2 columns or 1. What about marginalia? Is there space for marginalia or for interlinear glosses? How are people going to interact with the text? These are all really important considerations in how literacy functions in your fantasy world. And think about also where writing gets used outside of books and codices and scrolls. What about talking objects or inscriptions, or even tattoos, this kind of thing? There's all sorts of considerations of fantasy that one needs to come up with. And some sort of criticological consideration for fantasy as well, because this is a real thing that bugs me, is that books have a cost, and how much this is relative to other consumables in their world, it'll depend on the economy of your fantasy world. So you need to ask yourself some questions about literacy in your world, like what kinds of people in your society are literate and to what degree? So what kind of demand does this produce for books? How are books and their materials produced and exchanged? Is it a plant? Is it animal skins, which are going to be very expensive? Is there a long production process for how to make the writing surface? What are books used for? How do the illiterate understand books? Do they engage with books at all? Are there pictures for them? All of these kinds. Do they have interpreters? Who owns books? Who produces them? And who makes them? And why do these people make books? What's the purposes of having books? And even between books and codices, how do texts get transmitted across, within, and between books within your fantasy world? And one thing I really hate is when you go into a library in a fantasy world and it's like the Bell's library from Beauty and the Beast, and there's just tons of books everywhere that would have cost so much money, and it's an impossibly large library. Stop this. Medieval libraries, even the biggest ones, were relatively small, a few hundred books. Let's tone it down a bit. And there we go. This is it. So this is like the end of the course I envisioned, the sort of autodidactic paleography course. We've gone from the very beginning of the Latin alphabet, and we've also talked about the Gothic alphabet as well, and the runic alphabet. We've covered quite a few topics, but the Latin, the Gothic, the runic alphabet. We've gone from the beginning all the way until the printing press, and showing you how to read these scripts in medieval manuscripts. And I've had a lot of fun teaching this, making this course for you. And I hope the bonus week has given you a few things that you can take away and put into use in creative pursuits, even if you never look at a manuscript again, even if you're not a historian. I really hope that you can take away something of benefit from this course. And if I haven't been able to do that for you, I hope I've at least shown you why I love paleography so much. I think it's a real shame that the skills required to study medieval manuscripts are locked away behind the paywall of a master's degree, where it's usually taught, and is usually not even taught that well, to the level of being able to read the thing. And there's a lot of medieval history materials online. There's lots of videos about medieval martial arts, there's lots of videos about Roman history, Greek history, how to learn Latin, how to learn Greek. Jackson Crawford has a great channel for Old Norse, but there's nothing really for medieval paleography, which is a huge barrier for people being able to engage with manuscripts themselves. So I want to make a difference, and that's why I'm doing these videos, to give people the tools to read manuscripts themselves. And because of that, I wanted to extend the offer that if you're watching this and you want help with a transcription, you have a question about a manuscript, you have a question about what I've put in these videos, anything to that effect, any way I can help you with your paleography journey, you can email me at bellatricianlens@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to answer and help you out. But for now, that's the end of this course. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Farewell, well done, and don't let Titty Venus get you. Bye.